fog always settled thick over the Ozark Hills, but the night I arrived, it clung to the earth with an almost deliberate grip, as though trying to hide whatever lay beneath it. Locals at the general store fell silent the moment I asked about the ridge called the Hollow Line. Their eyes shifted, voices lowered, and one of them muttered that the woods had a memory too old for outsiders. I laughed politely, pretending I didn't notice the way his hand trembled, but inside, something cold coiled in my stomach. The deeper I drove into the hills, the more the landscape felt untouched by time, untouched by anything good. Trees leaned inward, their twisted branches forming a cage over the dirt road, and the air had a smell I couldn't place, like damp soil mixed with something that had been kept hidden too long. By the time I reached my small rental cabin, night had fully consumed the hills, and the forest pressed so close to the door that it felt alive, listening. I had come to investigate old settlements and forgotten lineages, nothing more. But the name that kept surfacing, Elias Ward, pulled me in like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. Some locals claimed he'd been a patriarch unlike any other. Others refused to speak his name at all, as if doing so might summon him. Rumors hinted at a family tree twisted beyond recognition, a legacy of bloodlines coiled back on themselves until truth and horror became indistinguishable. I told myself it was folklore, the usual mountain superstition. But on my first night, when I opened an old county registry and saw 3 boys listed as Elias Ward's sons, the mother's name scratched out with a dull blade, I felt that same cold coil tighten. And when the wind shifted, carrying a sound that was neither quite human nor entirely animal, I realized the hills weren't empty. They were waiting. They had always been waiting. And somewhere beyond the tree line, hidden by the woods that seemed to hold their breath, the most feared man in Ozark history, a man said to have fathered children with his own sister, was not nearly as gone as everyone prayed he was. The researchers' arrival in the Ozark Hills was not a moment marked by grand discovery but by a creeping sense of displacement, as though the land itself resisted the presence of an outsider. Driving along the narrow, winding roads, the researcher felt the hills looming like ancient guardians, their silhouettes cutting sharply against the fading daylight. The silence here was different, dense, almost heavy, as if thousands of unspoken stories lingered between the trees. The purpose of the trip was simple on paper: document abandoned settlements, interview locals, and collect archival fragments of forgotten communities for a regional history project. But the closer the researcher got to the heart of the Ozarks, the more that mission began to feel naive. The place had a way of pressing in on the senses, making even the most rational visitor feel as though something watched from behind the bark and stone. Upon reaching the first small town, the researcher noticed immediately that the locals were hospitable only in the most surface-level way. They offered directions and polite smiles, but their eyes carried a guarded look, as if weighing every word they chose to share. At the general store, when the researcher casually mentioned an interest in exploring all parts of the surrounding hills, an uneasy silence fell over the room. One of the older men, with skin weathered like old leather and a voice cracked from decades of mountain air, leaned forward and advised against wandering too far north. The ridge up there, known as the Hollow Line, wasn't a place for strangers, he said, not because of danger in the typical sense but because the woods weren't right and never had been. No one gave clear details, but the message was unmistakable: stay away. Instead of discouraging the researcher, these warnings ignited curiosity. What could be so unsettling about a ridge in the middle of wilderness? What history had been buried so deeply that even its name caused locals to stiffen? Every instinct suggested that the warnings were more than superstition, yet the pull of the unknown outweighed caution. After all, researchers thrived on unraveling mysteries, and this one seemed ripe with untold layers. Even so, the researcher couldn't shake the feeling of being studied, not by the townspeople but by the hills themselves. Shadows seemed to shift with the passing car, and the woods appeared to lean closer, narrowing the roads like claws encroaching on prey. By the time the researcher settled into the rented cabin on the outskirts of town, the sky had darkened completely, swallowing the hills in a thick blanket of night. With every distant rustle, every unexplained creak from the forest, the warnings echoed quietly in the mind, merging with a growing anticipation that something far older and stranger than folklore waited in the depths of the Ozark Hills. Locals did not speak the name Elias Ward lightly, and the researcher learned this almost immediately after settling into the rhythm of small-town conversations. The stories did not come openly, They were unearthed in fragments, in cautious glances, in hesitant whispers exchanged only when the wind was loud enough to drown them out. Whenever the researcher asked about forgotten families of the region, someone inevitably mentioned a patriarch who should have never been, though they avoided saying his name outright. These half-formed hints created a mosaic of dread long before any concrete information emerged. The townspeople carried an unease that felt inherited, as if every generation had been warned to keep quiet about one particular branch of their history. It wasn't shame they felt, it was fear, old and lingering like a stain that had sunk too deep to scrub out. The surname Ward appeared in dusty clerical ledgers, scribbled on the edges of forgotten land deeds, but always with wide gaps and missing entries. When the researcher pressed further, an elderly woman finally relented, though even she spoke with her eyes fixed on the door as though afraid someone might overhear. She said that Elias Ward had once been a towering force in these hills, a man whose presence consumed entire families. His influence wasn't measured in wealth or land but in the unsettling reach of his bloodline. For decades, he and his sister Marybeth lived in a secluded homestead built deep inside the hollow line, so isolated that some claimed even sunlight hesitated to touch their property. From that isolation came children, 3 boys, whom the community pretended belonged to no one. People looked away, not out of ignorance, but out of a desperate desire to avoid becoming entangled with the Ward legacy. The researcher noted how every mention of Elias was accompanied by a slight stiffening of posture, a subtle tightening of lips. It was as if the very memory of him still rippled through the hills, a ghost not tied to any single grave but to the land itself. The locals insisted Elias was a man shaped by the woods in ways they could never fully explain. They described him as someone who moved through the trees with the silence of a predator, a figure whose shadow stretched longer than any man's ought to. They claimed he held a power over his family that went beyond obedience, something that made them follow him into deeper and deeper isolation until their world shrank to the size of their bloodline. The researcher tried to interpret these stories as superstition, but there was a conviction in the locals' voices that made them impossible to dismiss entirely. The fear they held didn't feel like the product of rumor, it felt like the residue of something witnessed firsthand, something that had scarred the community in a way time could not fade. The old census book was discovered almost by accident, tucked away on a lower shelf in the county's neglected archive room, where dust blanketed the records like a second skin. The researcher had not expected to find anything remarkable that afternoon. The room smelled of mildew and long-forgotten stories, and most documents appeared routine: births, deaths, marriages, land ownership disputes. But when a brittle leather-bound volume slid forward as if nudged by an unseen hand, curiosity guided the researcher to open it. The pages crackled softly, their edges yellowed and fragile, each line handwritten by someone long dead. As the researcher flipped through the records of families who once lived in the Ozark Hills, a peculiar pattern emerged. Entire entries had been crossed out or obscured, usually with a firm, angry stroke of ink. It was as though someone had tried to erase certain people not just from the census, but from memory itself. Then came the page that made the researcher pause. It listed the Ward household, though not in any typical structure. Instead of multiple names neatly aligned with designated roles, there were only 4 individuals recorded: Elias Ward, his occupation noted simply as head, and 3 boys listed beneath him. Their ages were close: 9, 11, and 13, yet the column for mother had been replaced by a jagged line where a name should have been. The ink looked as if it had been furiously dragged across the page, as though the writer had been compelled to hide it, or perhaps protect themselves from what writing it might imply. The researcher touched the rough mark, tracing the indentation left by that violent motion, feeling a small ripple of dread. What made the entry stranger was the handwriting discrepancy. The boys' names had clearly been written by the census officer, but the line covering the mother's name was made by someone else: heavier strokes, different ink, and a pressure that nearly tore through the paper. This raised questions the researcher could not ignore. Why hide the mother's identity? Why attempt to erase it so forcefully? And why had no corrections or follow-up notes been made, as was custom when information was unclear? Digging deeper into the surrounding pages, the researcher noticed a pattern that suggested tampering. Several earlier entries concerning the Ward family seemed smudged or partially erased, as if someone had repeatedly attempted to manipulate their recorded existence. It was subtle enough to escape a casual reader, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years studying archival inconsistencies. The more the researcher examined the book, the more it became clear that this was not an administrative error. It was deliberate concealment. The discovery created a sense of unease that the researcher could not shake. The boys existed, at least on paper, but the record of their mother, Marybeth, according to whispered stories, was deliberately buried under a stroke of ink. And the deeper implication slowly formed like a shadow stretching across the page. The community had not merely forgotten the truth, they had helped hide it. The photograph surfaced on a day when the researcher had begun to believe that the most disturbing pieces of the Ward story would forever remain buried in hearsay. It was found inside a warped wooden drawer in the town's Historical Society office, a place that looked more like an attic than a public archive. Faded brochures, broken frames, and stacks of unorganized documents cluttered every corner. The researcher sifted through them with the routine numbness that comes after hours of searching, expecting little more than irrelevant scraps. But when a small, cloth-bound envelope fell from between two brittle land maps, something about its weight felt different, too deliberate, too carefully set aside. The flap had no seal, only a faint stain where glue once held it together, and inside lay a single, decades-old photograph. The image was washed in the sepia tones of a time long past. Two figures stood in front of a sagging wooden house nearly swallowed by vines. The man, unmistakably Elias Ward, was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture rigid as if confronting the camera rather than posing for it. His expression, even through the grainy texture, carried an unsettling stillness, eyes that didn't merely look but seemed to measure. Yet it was the woman beside him who drew the researcher's breath short. She had the same sharp cheekbones, the same downturn at the corner of her eyes, the same narrow jawline. The resemblance was not subtle, it was jarring. Her name didn't need to be written on the back for the researcher to know she was Marybeth Ward, Elias's sister. Their closeness in the photograph was unnatural, though nothing explicit marked it so. It was in the way Elias's arm hovered behind Marybeth's back, not quite touching but positioned as though he owned the space she occupied. It was in Marybeth's expression, caught between fear and resignation, her eyes fixed not on the camera but slightly to the left, as if watching someone approach or anticipating a command. The photographer, whoever they were, must have sensed the tension too. The shot was slightly off-center, as if taken quickly or with unease. The house behind them bore its own ominous weight. Boards were nailed across one window from the inside, and the front door hung crookedly, suggesting years of neglect. Yet the porch displayed signs of recent use, a rocking chair angled toward the yard, a pair of boots left neatly beside it. It was a place lived in, but not lived well. The researcher turned the photograph over, hoping for a date or a name, but the back was blank except for a faint fingerprint smudged near the edge. That lonely fingerprint felt more intimate than any written label, as though the last person to hold this photo had done so with trembling hands. It made the researcher feel as though they were intruding on a moment never meant to be preserved, and certainly never meant to be found. Strange sightings began almost immediately after the photograph's discovery, though the researcher tried at first to rationalize each encounter as exhaustion, paranoia, or tricks of light slipping through the thick Ozark canopy. Still, the occurrences piled up too steadily to ignore. While hiking toward the hollow line, guided only by vague directions and the pull of unanswered questions, the researcher first sensed something was wrong. It was the feeling of being watched, subtle yet persistent, like a weight pressing between the shoulder blades. Every few steps, the forest would fall unnaturally silent, as if the wind itself were holding its breath. Birdsong cut off abruptly. Leaves stopped rustling. The entire landscape seemed to pause whenever the researcher tried to listen closely, resuming its movements only when attention wavered. The first sighting happened near a patch of fern-covered ground where the trees grew thin. Between the trunks, a figure stood tall, unmoving, shaped unmistakably like a man. But there was something off about the posture, the way the limbs looked slightly too long, the way the head turned in a slow, jerking motion not aligned with the body. The researcher blinked once, and the figure melted deeper into the shadows, slipping away with a speed and silence no human should possess. The encounter left the researcher shaken, yet curiosity clawed its way above fear. Perhaps it had been an illusion, or a local hunter, or even a bear standing upright. But deep down, a part of the researcher knew the silhouette had felt wrong in a way that instinct recognized long before reason did. As days passed, the sightings increased. Tracks appeared around the cabin in the mornings, imprints too large to be a child's, but too oddly shaped to belong to any known animal. At night, faint shuffling noises circled the property, accompanied by low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from more than one direction at once. The researcher would jerk awake to the sensation of something brushing against the outer wall, only for the noise to stop abruptly when the light was turned on. Once, while reviewing field notes at the small desk near the window, the researcher sensed movement outside. When the curtain was pulled aside, two glowing eyes stared back from the darkness, set at a height too unusual to dismiss as wildlife. They vanished before the researcher could react, leaving behind only the echo of heavy footsteps fading into the trees. Locals offered no comfort. When the researcher described the sightings, their reactions were disturbingly resigned. They warned that the woods had grown watchers over the years, figures that moved like men but lived like shadows. None dared to say the sons' names aloud, but the implication was clear: whatever lived in those woods was not a rumor. It was a presence shaped by isolation, lineage, and something far older than fear. The researcher quickly learned that the three sons of Elias Ward were not merely absent, they had vanished, leaving a silence that the community seemed desperate to preserve. At first, it was a passing comment from a store clerk, almost casual, almost dismissive, as though the words themselves might summon the memory of what the town refused to name. "They went back to the earth," he said, voice low, eyes darting toward the door as though someone, or something, might overhear. The researcher pressed for clarification, asking when exactly they had disappeared, but the clerk shook his head, muttering that some things weren't meant for outsiders. There was a distinct unease in his tone, a tremor that belied the casual phrasing, hinting that behind those words lay a story the town had long agreed never to tell. Every other local approached the subject with the same careful hesitation, speaking around the son's existence, referring only to shadows, echoes, or the boys who never left. Digging through newspaper clippings, the researcher found a few sparse mentions: a missing persons report filed decades ago, dismissed quickly as a matter of family moving, or children lost to rural life. No photographs accompanied these notices, no follow-up stories were ever published, and the names of the boys appeared and vanished from records as if erased by collective memory. The official documents offered no answers, only voids, reinforcing the impression that something unnatural had occurred. In conversations with older residents, the researcher began to detect a recurring pattern. Each story was punctuated by a pause, a moment where the speaker's gaze hardened and they spoke more cautiously, as if sensing the weight of the land itself listening in. The sons, it seemed, were woven into a history that had been consciously hidden, one that neither documents nor witnesses could fully expose without consequence. One afternoon, in the shadow of the hollow line, a retired schoolteacher offered a rare, fractured glimpse into the past. She recalled Elias Ward's obsession with isolation, how he had deliberately kept the boys away from school, neighbors, and even their extended family. He wanted no interference, no prying eyes, and she suggested that his insistence on seclusion had allowed the children to disappear without leaving traceable marks. There were rumors, whispered at funerals and church gatherings, that the boys' vanishing was tied to rituals of secrecy passed down through the Ward bloodline, actions the townspeople were afraid to acknowledge aloud. To them, speaking the truth carried the weight of an unseen threat, an implication that some malevolent force, or perhaps the patriarch himself, still lingered in the hills, enforcing silence. As the researcher absorbed these fragmented accounts, a cold realization took root. The boys' absence was not a coincidence or mere neglect, it was intentional. The hills had swallowed them, not entirely in a literal sense but through generations of fear, complicity, and secrecy. The researcher began to understand that uncovering their fate would require walking the fine line between history and horror, between curiosity and danger, where one misstep might awaken forces the town had spent decades trying to contain. The abandoned cabin appeared almost as if it had grown from the earth itself, nestled between gnarled oaks and dense underbrush that clawed at its warped wooden walls. From the outside, it seemed ordinary enough for the Ozark Hills, a small, one-room structure with a slanted roof and windows clouded with decades of grime. Yet there was an unsettling quality to it, something in the way the shadows pooled beneath its eaves and the way the surrounding forest seemed to bend inward, forming a natural barrier that kept the casual observer at bay. When the researcher approached, the door creaked ominously, its hinges long rusted and stiff, and the smell of damp earth and rot struck immediately, so thick it seemed almost tangible. Each step across the threshold produced a sharp, hollow echo that seemed too loud for such a small room, as if the cabin itself resented being disturbed. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings, crude and frenetic, etched deep enough that they had cut into the bare wood beneath the surface. The symbols twisted and looped in patterns that made the researcher's stomach tighten, suggesting both ritual and warning. Some resembled letters, others geometric shapes, yet none formed anything recognizable in ordinary terms. The carvings created a disorienting effect, as though the cabin itself was alive, shifting subtly when viewed from different angles, a maze of intention and menace. The floorboards were scarred and worn, suggesting decades of movement, yet the markings were so erratic that it was impossible to tell whether they were the result of hurried footsteps or deliberate pacing over time. Dust swirled in the weak light, disturbed by the researcher's intrusion, revealing faint footprints that had accumulated in the corners, evidence of someone or something having been there recently. The air carried a weight beyond decay, pressing down on the chest and forcing shallow breaths. Every corner seemed to whisper, every shadow stretched longer than it should, and the faint scratch of something moving outside the cabin punctuated the silence in ways that felt almost communicative. On the back wall, an especially intricate series of carvings formed a spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward, giving the impression of depth where none existed, as if the cabin itself were a gateway to something hidden beneath the forest floor. The researcher traced the symbols with gloved fingers, noting faint streaks of discoloration that suggested the wood had been repeatedly rubbed, almost like the surface had been consecrated or cursed over time. It became clear that the carvings were not meant to protect the occupant from intruders, they were meant to keep something inside, a force the wards had cultivated over generations. The air felt thick with their lingering presence, a combination of fear, obsession, and meticulous control that had been pressed into the very grain of the wood. Standing there, the researcher understood that the cabin was more than an abandoned structure, it was a repository of secrecy, a physical manifestation of the Ward bloodline's darkest impulses, and a warning that some histories, once buried, still hold the power to reach beyond the grave. The discovery of Marybeth Ward's diary came unexpectedly, hidden beneath a pile of charred papers in the corner of the cabin, tucked inside a cracked wooden box that looked as though it had been deliberately concealed. The leather cover was stiff with age, the edges frayed and brittle, and the pages within were yellowed, smelling faintly of smoke and earth. As the researcher opened it, the handwriting immediately drew attention. Small, precise, almost delicate, with letters looping tightly, revealing a mind constantly measuring its words even as it poured out thoughts. From the first lines, it was clear that this was not a casual journal, it was a meticulous record of life under Elias Ward's roof, written with the intention of both confession and concealment. Each entry carried a weight, as if every word had been chosen to document truths that could not otherwise be spoken aloud, and the researcher felt the chilling intimacy of reading thoughts meant for no one's eyes. The diary painted a picture of a household shaped by secrecy and obsession. Marybeth wrote of her brother's insistence on isolation, how he believed that their bloodline carried a unique gift that could only be preserved if the family remained cut off from the outside world. He monitored every interaction, every expression, every sound that came from the children, ensuring that the influence of the hills, the forest, and the lineage itself remained unbroken. Marybeth's entries revealed the psychological weight of growing up under such control, of being both participant and observer in rituals and customs that were almost incomprehensible to anyone outside their walls. She described the children, the 3 boys, as extensions of this lineage, vessels meant to embody and carry forward the Ward blood, their lives shaped more by heredity than by any personal choice. As the researcher read on, it became clear that Marybeth herself had been both a victim and an enforcer, caught in a cycle dictated by a man whose authority was absolute. Her words were candid, almost clinical at times, documenting methods and routines designed to keep the boys ignorant of the outside world while simultaneously teaching them the rules of the family's hidden hierarchy. There were hints of fear, yes, but also a strange reverence for the power Elias wielded over them all, a recognition that he viewed their lineage not merely as inheritance but as a responsibility that demanded extreme measures. In the diary, she described evenings when Elias would walk the ridge lines, calling the children to him in ways that left Marybeth trembling, detailing conversations and instructions meant to mold both body and mind according to his vision of what the family should become. The researcher began to sense a logic underlying the horror. This was a family shaped by obsession, isolation, and a distorted sense of purpose. Each entry of the diary revealed the deliberate cultivation of a secret legacy, one that intertwined fear, blood, and power so tightly that it seemed impossible to unravel. Marybeth's words suggested that what outsiders might consider cruelty was, to them, necessity and extreme preservation of a line meant to endure, even if at the cost of humanity itself. By the final pages, the researcher felt the full weight of that realization. The Ward family's history was not just hidden, it was actively maintained, written into every action, every rule, and every heartbeat of the children who carried forward the darkness of their lineage. The first real encounter with the sons came long after the researcher had begun to feel the weight of the hills pressing in, their presence subtle but unrelenting, shaping every shadow and sound. At first, it had been glimpses, figures moving at the periphery of vision, vanishing before they could be fully identified, or strange sounds that suggested more than mere wildlife. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the dense ridges and cast the forest into elongated, twisted shadows, the researcher finally saw them clearly. 3 figures stood at the edge of a clearing, partially obscured by trees but unmistakably human in shape. Yet there was something disturbingly off about their movements. They were unnaturally rigid, limbs stiff, their gait uneven, as if generations of isolation had warped both their bodies and their instincts. When they turned their heads, the researcher noticed the features: elongated faces, pale skin marked with irregular patterns, eyes too large and alert, scanning with a precision that suggested both fear and a predatory awareness. The sons did not speak. They did not move toward or away from the researcher, merely observing, their presence heavy and unyielding. It was clear they had been shaped by the hills, by the isolation of the Ward cabin, by the obsessive control of Elias and Marybeth. Each carried an air of alertness, as though any misstep could summon punishment or consequence. Their eyes, dark and wide, seemed to record everything, cataloguing the intruder in ways that felt almost inhuman. The forest around them held still, the usual noises of crickets and rustling leaves muted in a way that amplified the unnaturalness of the encounter. The researcher, heart-hammering, realized that these were not ordinary men, they were the product of decades of secrecy, twisted customs, and a bloodline deliberately preserved apart from the world. Over the following days, the sons continued to appear in glimpses, standing atop ridges watching the cabin, lingering near the forest edges while the researcher documented maps and notes, disappearing when approached. Their behavior suggested intelligence, but it was filtered through the distorted lens of a life confined entirely to the wilderness, trained to survive and to obey rules the outside world could not understand. Attempts to communicate were met with silence or gestures that were almost ritualistic, reinforcing the sense that these individuals existed by their own code, a code inherited and enforced, rather than by the norms of ordinary society. Even their movements, while deliberate, carried an eerie grace, animalistic in rhythm but human in form, as though the long isolation had merged instinct and cognition in ways impossible to categorize. The researcher began to sense the truth that locals had long hinted at but refused to name. These sons were not simply missing, they were the embodiment of the Ward legacy, a lineage preserved through secrecy and distortion. Their existence was both a warning and a revelation, an unspoken testament to the obsessive control of Elias Ward, and a haunting confirmation that the hills held more than memory, they held life, warped and vigilant, shaped by blood and darkness, waiting, always watching. The realization that Elias Ward might still be alive came not as a sudden shock, but as a creeping, suffocating understanding, a truth that unfolded piece by piece as the researcher pieced together fragments from the diary, the photograph, and the sightings of the sons. For decades, local law insisted that he had vanished, died, or retreated entirely into the forest, leaving only the distorted legacy of his children behind. But patterns began to emerge that suggested otherwise. The cabin, though abandoned in appearance, bore signs of recent occupation. The fire pit outside held embers that had been disturbed, footprints in the surrounding dirt shifted and changed with no discernible explanation, and the carvings on the walls seemed fresher than the decades-old dust would allow. It became increasingly difficult to believe that the patriarch had truly left, when every trace suggested an unseen presence guiding, controlling, or watching from the shadows. The researcher began to notice subtle movements in the tree line at odd hours. Figures crouched in the darkness, far too deliberate to be random wildlife, their silhouettes hinting at a human height and posture that did not match the sun's earlier appearances. And there was something intangible, an energy that seemed to pulse through the very air around the hollow line, a tension that thickened whenever the researcher ventured deeper. On multiple occasions, low whistles carried through the forest, deliberate and patterned, almost like a signal, echoing in the hollows in ways no wind could produce. These auditory cues, paired with the sun's apparent responsiveness to unseen commands, suggested the presence of a leader, a force that still maintained dominion over the bloodline and the forest that concealed it. Investigating further, the researcher uncovered hidden paths winding deeper into the hills, overgrown but unmistakably trodden, some leading toward areas where light barely penetrated the canopy. Evidence of habitation, makeshift shelters, remnants of food, carefully arranged items hinted at a life lived entirely in secret, an existence hidden from maps, records, and memory. It became clear that the patriarch had not abandoned his lineage, he had entrenched himself, becoming the unseen architect of a small, isolated kingdom built on the distorted logic of blood and isolation. Every aspect of the son's behavior, every symbol carved into the cabin, every whisper among the townspeople, pointed back to him as the enduring center of control. By the final night of observation, the researcher felt an undeniable weight in the air, a presence that pressed closer than any human could. Shadows shifted too deliberately, the forest seemed to breathe with purpose, and a faint, almost imperceptible movement suggested someone or something watched from the dark heart of the hills. The full magnitude of the truth settled like ice. Elias Ward had never truly died. He had become one with the hollow line, a patriarch ruling over a legacy of secrecy and distorted lineage, a hidden force shaping the lives of his blood, ready to assert his presence against any who dared intrude. And in that moment, the researcher understood that the history of the Ward family was not merely a story of the past, it was an ongoing, living enigma, a darkness that had endured for generations and was far from finished.